Pimp C built a legendary hip-hop empire on a ruthless persona and the glorification of codeine syrup, but the fatal reality was hidden from the public. Suffering from severe sleep apnea, drinking lean was a biological death sentence. While his entourage watched his health visibly fail, they kept the money flowing instead of getting him medical help. He died alone in a hotel room in 2007, suffocating in his sleep. This is the cold, factual truth of how an untreated medical condition and industry enablers killed a king. A deeply unsettling incident occurred in the middle of a crowded, brightly lit shopping mall, an event that perfectly encapsulates the terrifying disconnect between a manufactured public identity and the fragile human being trapped inside it. A globally recognized recording artist, a man fiercely protected by heavy security details and surrounded by sycophants, completely lost his grip on reality over a trivial interaction. He approached a woman shopping in the mall, and when she simply stated that she did not recognize him or know his name, his reaction was not a bruised ego or a dismissive comment. He reached into his clothing, pulled out a loaded firearm, and aggressively threatened the life of a civilian in broad daylight. This was the violent, completely unhinged behavior of the persona the world worshipped as Pimp C. The public and the music industry eagerly consumed this terrifying outburst, categorizing it as the ultimate proof of his authentic, ruthless street credibility. They celebrated the aggression, viewing the firearm and the volatile temper as essential components of the hardcore Southern hip-hop aesthetic he had pioneered. The media actively sold this image of an untouchable, dangerous kingpin who demanded absolute respect through the threat of lethal force. Before his central nervous system was hijacked by liquid opiates, he was an absolute, uncompromising musical prodigy. The industry and the consumers frequently categorized him merely as a loud, aggressive vocalist, entirely ignoring the fact that he was the primary sonic architect of an entire regional movement. He was a classically trained musician who meticulously constructed the dense, analog, soul-heavy aesthetic known as country rap tunes. He did not simply rap over prepackaged digital beats. He physically arranged live organs, guitars, and heavy percussion. He built a highly specific, geographically isolated auditory fortress, and he viewed any external interference with that architecture as a direct hostile corporate invasion. This deep-seated, almost pathological need to maintain absolute operational autonomy collided violently with the apex of the mainstream music industry in the winter of 1999. The defining incident occurred when Jay-Z, the reigning undisputed billionaire kingpin of East Coast hip-hop, initiated a strategic corporate merger. Jay-Z's syndicate reached out to UGK to feature on a track titled Big Pimpin'. In the rigid, highly opportunistic calculus of the music business, a feature request from an artist of that magnitude is essentially a winning lottery ticket. It is a guaranteed mechanism for massive, unprecedented global market penetration. For a Southern group striving for mainstream legitimacy, it was professional suicide to decline. Chad Butler's immediate visceral reaction to this multi-million-dollar proposal was absolute aggressive rejection. When he was presented with the instrumental track, a bouncy, highly synthesized electronic production engineered by Timbaland, Butler was completely repulsed. From a clinical, artistic standpoint, he viewed the synthetic aesthetic not as an opportunity, but as a cultural infection. It violated every fundamental acoustic principle of the analog, heavy bass environment he had spent a decade building. More critically, from a psychological perspective, he perceived the collaboration as a highly predatory extraction protocol. He believed the East Coast corporate machine was attempting to cynically harvest his authentic Southern street credibility to sanitize and authenticate their own glossy mainstream product. He initiated a massive high-stakes standoff with both his own record label, Jive, and the Def Jam corporate hierarchy. He flatly refused to record the vocals. He prioritized his localized, uncompromising code of sonic ethics over the promise of exponential wealth. He was a man fiercely guarding his perimeter, terrified that if he allowed the mainstream industry to alter his sound, they would eventually consume his entire identity. It required intense, agonizing coercion from his musical partner Bun B, and the looming threat of severe contractual retaliation from his corporate handlers to finally force him into the recording booth. However, Butler did not submit gracefully. He executed a masterpiece of calculated, passive-aggressive, artistic sabotage. Instead of delivering a standard 16-bar verse designed to seamlessly integrate with the pop-friendly aesthetic of the song, he recorded a hostile, aggressively truncated 8-bar vocal. He delivered his lyrics with a deliberate, venomous sneer, rapidly recorded his section, and immediately threatened to withhold the vocal stems entirely if the engineers attempted to alter his pitch or timing. The most visually iconic, terrifyingly authentic manifestation of this psychological rebellion occurred during the subsequent video shoot. The corporate labels funded a massive multi-million-dollar visual production in Miami, Florida, and Trinidad, featuring luxury yachts, tropical environments, and heavily choreographed party sequences. It was a highly sanitized, highly expensive corporate celebration. Chad Butler arrived at the sweltering tropical video set, openly projecting absolute, unyielding hostility. In the middle of the blazing Miami heat, surrounded by executives and models in swimwear, Butler refused to conform to the wardrobe direction. He stubbornly wore a massive, heavy white mink coat. When coerced into shooting the Big Pimpin' video in the sweltering Miami heat, Butler refused the wardrobe direction. Standing on a luxury yacht surrounded by swimwear, he stubbornly wore a heavy white mink coat. It wasn't a fashion statement, it was a physical barricade, a silent protest against a mainstream assimilation he fundamentally despised. He stood on the deck of the luxury yacht, sweating profusely inside the heavy fur, glaring directly into the camera lens with absolute contempt. He was silently broadcasting a clear, undeniable message to the corporate executives. You can purchase my audio hardware, you can force me onto this boat, but you will never assimilate my mind. The devastating, deeply tragic irony of this entire standoff is that his deliberate attempt at sabotage backfired with catastrophic success. The public did not perceive his truncated verse and his heavy fur coat as a protest. They consumed it as absolute, unvarnished brilliance. His 8 bars became the most iconic, widely quoted section of the entire platinum-selling record. His hostile refusal to cooperate ironically provided the exact raw, dangerous authenticity the corporate machine was searching for. Big Pimpin' became a massive, historic global phenomenon, directly responsible for dragging Chad Butler out of his localized Southern stronghold and permanently thrusting him into the blinding, unforgiving spotlight of the mainstream global market. He fought desperately to keep the corporate meat grinder away from his perimeter, but his own undeniable mechanical genius accidentally turned the key and locked him inside the machine. From that moment forward, the intense, suffocating pressure of mainstream expectations multiplied exponentially, accelerating his reliance on the very chemical sedatives that would eventually be required to quiet the noise of the empire he never actually wanted to build. Beneath this heavy, intimidating exterior of fur coats, diamond jewelry, and calculated intimidation, the biological and psychological reality of Chad Butler was a narrative of profound, lifelong physical vulnerability. He was not born a hardened enforcer, destined to rule the streets. He entered the world prematurely, a highly fragile infant who spent the earliest moments of his existence confined to a hospital incubator, fighting desperately for basic survival. This premature birth left him with a permanently compromised respiratory system and a weak physical constitution that he would battle for the entirety of his life. The most severe, life-threatening consequence of this early biological deficit was a chronic, agonizing condition known as severe sleep apnea. This is not merely a loud snore or a restless night of sleep. It is a terrifying medical disorder where the brain fundamentally fails to send the correct signals to the respiratory muscles during unconsciousness. For his entire adult life, his airway would physically collapse while he slept, causing him to stop breathing entirely dozens of times every single night. He lived with the constant subconscious terror of his own body actively attempting to suffocate him in the dark, waking up violently, gasping for oxygen, his heart racing in a state of perpetual biological panic. This chronic physical exhaustion was catastrophically compounded by a severe, clinically diagnosed psychiatric condition. He suffered from bipolar disorder, a complex neurological illness characterized by terrifying violent swings between extreme, impulsive manic highs and crushing, paralyzing, depressive lows. Navigating the world with an untreated bipolar brain is akin to driving a high-performance vehicle with no brakes and a constantly malfunctioning steering wheel. The sudden outbursts of rage, the reckless financial decisions, and the hyper-aggressive confrontations were not calculated career moves designed to build a tough reputation. They were the textbook, clinical symptoms of a man experiencing severe manic episodes in real time. In a functioning, compassionate society, a patient presenting these dual diagnoses of severe respiratory failure and bipolar disorder would be placed under strict medical supervision and heavily monitored psychiatric care. However, the commercial music industry operates on a completely different, entirely parasitic metric. The executives and the consumers looked at a sick, erratic man and immediately recognized a highly marketable, infinitely profitable product. They did not want to treat the illness. They wanted to put a heavy baseline behind it and sell it to millions of teenagers. The heavy, chronic consumption of liquid narcotics and cocaine was never a recreational choice, nor was it a celebratory indulgence of his massive wealth. Suffering from bipolar disorder and severe sleep apnea, Butler self-medicated. Prescription psychiatric drugs often dulled the aggressive, high-energy persona that generated his income. So he found his own lethal equilibrium. Cocaine for the manic highs and codeine syrup to numb the depressive lows. The industry didn't necessarily prescribe the poison, but they eagerly monetized the erratic, hyper-masculine character it produced. turning a blind eye to the dying man underneath. He turned to a lethal combination of powerful central nervous system stimulants and heavy depressants. He utilized cocaine to forcefully drag himself out of the crippling depressive lows, snorting the chemical to artificially manufacture the energy required to command massive stadium crowds and fulfill grueling promotional schedules. Conversely, to artificially silence the screaming, chaotic voices of his manic phases and to numb the physical pain of his failing body, he consumed astronomical quantities of prescription-grade codeine and promethazine syrup. The global audience eagerly adopted the purple liquid as a cool, rebellious cultural trend, entirely blind to the horrifying biological paradox occurring within his body. Codeine is a powerful respiratory depressant. He was a man suffering from severe sleep apnea, a condition where his body already frequently forgot how to breathe, and he was actively, daily flooding his bloodstream with a heavy narcotic designed specifically to slow down respiratory function. He was chemically engineering his own suffocation every single time he lifted that cup to his mouth. The industry actively glorified this slow-motion suicide, funding the studio sessions where he recorded anthems praising the very syrup that was methodically destroying his lungs and brain. The fans bought the albums, chanted the lyrics, and validated the addiction, ensuring that the supply lines of the lethal liquid remained completely uninterrupted. To further protect the fragile, sick man hiding beneath the surface, he constructed an impenetrable fortress of hypertoxic masculinity and aggressive sexual dominance. The moniker he adopted was not an accident. It was a deliberate, highly calculated projection of absolute patriarchal power designed to completely obscure his deep-seated insecurities. He engaged in a lifestyle of rampant, highly destructive promiscuity, organizing massive group sexual encounters and deliberately filming explicit, highly degrading sex tapes with prominent figures in the entertainment industry. He did not keep these tapes hidden. He weaponized them, utilizing the explicit footage as leverage and undeniable proof of his absolute dominance over others. He reduced the women in his life to mere props, utilizing their bodies to visually reinforce his manufactured identity as an untouchable, ruthless controller of human beings. This relentless pursuit of sexual conquest was a frantic, deeply pathetic attempt to convince the world, and more importantly, to convince himself that he was a powerful, invincible force of nature, rather than a terrified, physically failing patient heavily dependent on liquid opiates just to survive the night. He became a prisoner of his own highly successful commercial creation. The global market demanded the ruthless, syrup-sipping, aggressively dominant character, and the corporate executives ensured he was financially rewarded only when he performed that specific, highly destructive role. The human being born as Chad Butler was systematically erased, suffocated entirely by the heavy gold chains, the fur coats, and the lethal chemical dependencies required to keep the persona functioning. He was trapped in a highly lucrative hostage situation where the ransom was his own physical and mental health. The industry actively funded his severe psychiatric breakdowns. The media aggressively promoted his violent outbursts as brilliant marketing, and the consumers eagerly devoured the toxic byproduct of his failing biology. The stage was perfectly set for a catastrophic physical collapse, as the fragile human foundation could no longer support the massive, rotting weight of the empire built directly on top of it. The inevitable collision between his increasingly volatile, unmedicated psychiatric state and the rigid, unforgiving machinery of the American judicial system occurred exactly as the corporate executives had anticipated, though they actively profited from the resulting fallout rather than attempting to prevent it. He was not apprehended for a highly sophisticated cinematic criminal enterprise, but rather for a highly impulsive, fundamentally irrational aggravated assault that violated the strict terms of his probation. This legal misstep forcefully removed him from the heavily insulated, sycophantic environment of the recording studio and thrust him directly into the cold mechanical reality of the Texas state penal system. He was abruptly stripped of the luxurious fur coats, the heavy diamond chains, and the commanding, untouchable persona he had meticulously constructed. The state reduced a global cultural icon to a mere string of digits printed onto an uncomfortable standard issue uniform. However, the true horror of his incarceration was not the loss of his liberty or the temporary suspension of his musical career. It was the absolute catastrophic destruction of his already fragile biological foundation by a system that views human beings entirely as disposable, profit-generating inventory. During the specific years of his confinement, the state of Texas was aggressively expanding and optimizing a highly lucrative, deeply predatory prison industrial complex. This system was not fundamentally designed to rehabilitate broken individuals, offer crucial psychiatric interventions, or correct antisocial behavior. It operated as a massive, hyper-efficient corporate warehousing operation, specifically engineered to lock away thousands of marginalized, predominantly minority individuals to generate guaranteed, taxpayer-funded revenue streams for private investors and municipal budgets. Inside this concrete ecosystem, the physical health and baseline medical needs of the inmates were viewed as unnecessary overhead costs that actively cut into the profit margins of the facility. He entered the prison gates with a relatively standard physical frame, but he was immediately subjected to the brutal, highly calculated, nutritional negligence of the state. The inmates were systematically fed incredibly cheap, highly processed, low-grade carbohydrates entirely devoid of genuine nutritional value, designed simply to meet the absolute minimum caloric requirements mandated by law while maximizing institutional profits. For a man already suffering from a severely compromised cardiovascular system and profound untreated psychiatric disorders, this forced dietary regimen was a slow, agonizing biological death sentence. Deprived of the ability to manage his own diet, stripped of adequate physical mobility, and confined to a highly stressful, deeply traumatizing environment, his body rapidly and aggressively deteriorated. He experienced a terrifying, completely unmanageable explosion in his physical weight. He mutated from a standard extra-large frame into a morbidly obese, dangerously heavy for extra-large physique. The prison system essentially force-fed a vulnerable patient into a state of severe, life-threatening obesity, entirely indifferent to the catastrophic pressure this massive weight gain placed upon his internal organs. This extreme physical transformation was not merely a cosmetic issue. It was a devastating medical crisis that exponentially accelerated the lethal trajectory of his pre-existing congenital defects. The most terrifying immediate consequence of this state-sponsored physical destruction was the extreme exacerbation of his severe sleep apnea. The mass 5 layers of excess adipose tissue severely compressed his chest cavity and his respiratory tract. Sleeping on a thin, uncomfortable mattress in a cold concrete cell, surrounded by the constant, chaotic noise of the penitentiary, became a nightly, agonizing fight for absolute survival. His airway would completely collapse under the crushing weight of his own body, abruptly cutting off the oxygen supply to his brain. He was choking to death dozens of times every single night, violently waking up in the dark, gasping for air, in a state of sheer biological panic. The correctional officers patrolling the cell blocks possessed absolutely no medical training and harbored no genuine concern for the respiratory function of the inmates. If his heart had simply given out during one of those terrifying episodes of oxygen deprivation, his body would have merely been processed as another acceptable statistical loss within the system. He was forced to endure the profound psychological torture of knowing that his own body was actively trying to suffocate him, and the very institution mandated to monitor him would do absolutely nothing to intervene. While he was physically suffocating in a Texas prison cell, the massive commercial music machine outside the walls was aggressively and shamelessly monetizing his absence. The record labels, his management team, and the media did not launch campaigns advocating for his urgent medical release or highlighting the severe deterioration of his physical health. Instead, they recognized that an incarcerated, highly famous rapper possessed an immense, highly lucrative street credibility that could be easily packaged and sold to suburban consumers. They initiated a massive, highly profitable marketing campaign centered entirely around the demand for his freedom. They printed millions of t-shirts, released heavily promoted compilation albums, and encouraged massive stadium crowds to chant his name. This was not a genuine, compassionate movement. T for human justice. It was a highly calculated brand maintenance strategy. The industry was actively keeping his cultural relevance at an absolute boiling point, ensuring that the consumer demand for his eventual return would translate directly into unprecedented historic album sales. They were utilizing his physical incarceration and his silent, agonizing suffering as a free, incredibly effective promotional tool to line their own pockets while he fought for breath in the dark. When the heavy steel gates finally opened and he was released back into society in late 2005, the man who walked out was entirely unrecognizable. He was physically shattered. His respiratory system was critically compromised, and his mind was deeply traumatized by years of untreated bipolar disorder inside a hostile environment. In any rational, medically sound, or remotely compassionate scenario, his immediate destination would have been a highly specialized hospital for comprehensive cardiac and pulmonary evaluations, followed by intensive, long-term psychiatric rehabilitation. He desperately required a strict, medically supervised weight loss regimen, a continuous positive airway pressure machine to keep him alive while he slept, and total isolation from the toxic triggers of his past. But the predatory ecosystem waiting for him at the prison gates did not bring doctors or medical equipment. They brought heavily binding recording contracts, aggressive touring schedules, and an insatiable, terrifying demand for immediate commercial product. The industry executives and the sycophantic entourage immediately descended upon a dying, breathless man, violently shoving him right back onto the relentless corporate treadmill. The market had been artificially starved of his presence for years, and the executives were absolutely determined to aggressively cash in on the massive, manufactured hype they had carefully cultivated during his incarceration. They entirely ignored the glare, horrifying reality of his physical decay. When he wheezed heavily after walking a short distance, when he struggled to physically fit into standard seating, and when he exhibited clear, terrifying signs of severe sleep deprivation, the industry handlers simply looked the other way. They placed a microphone in front of a man whose lungs were actively failing and aggressively demanded that he resurrect the exact, highly toxic persona that had generated millions of dollars before his imprisonment. They required the aggressive, unapologetic kingpin, and they were perfectly willing to supply whatever lethal chemicals were necessary to force that specific character back into existence. He was instantly thrust back into the very core of the lethal syrup culture that he had previously helped to popularize and legitimize for the mainstream audience. The industry demanded that he lean heavily into this specific, highly destructive aesthetic, pushing him to continue sanctifying the liquid opiate lifestyle because it resonated so powerfully with the youthful purchasing demographic. He was surrounded by a terrifying parasitic network of enablers, producers, and alleged friends who recognized exactly what the chemicals were doing to his massive failing body, yet actively continued to procure and supply the poison. They watched him pour the heavy prescription-grade codeine and promethazine into his cups, fully aware that the respiratory depressant was a literal death sentence for a morbidly obese man suffering from critical sleep apnea. No one in his immediate circle, no one signing his massive royalty checks, and no one profiting off his sold-out concert appearances ever stepped forward to forcefully snatch the cup from his hand. The chilling, unvarnished reality of this ecosystem is that the people cheering him on, the people calling him a legend and a genius, were the exact same individuals who were actively, methodically pouring the lethal dosage. They functioned as silent, highly compensated accomplices to his slow-motion execution. They fundamentally understood that initiating a genuine medical intervention, forcing him to get clean, and prioritizing his baseline physical health would immediately halt the massive daily influx of cash. A sober, hospitalized, and recovering artist cannot embark on a highly profitable, grueling 50-city promotional tour. The entourage needed the money to maintain their own lavish lifestyles, and the executives needed the quarterly revenue to satisfy their corporate boards. Therefore, the absolute consensus of the entire industry was to simply let the man continue to drink the poison, actively ignoring the death rattle in his chest, as long as the vocal tracks were delivered to the mastering engineers on time. The industry had successfully resuscitated his commercial viability post-incarceration, but his internal neurological architecture was rapidly collapsing. This deterioration culminated in a highly documented explosive psychological malfunction, broadcasted live across the American South. In August 2007, just 4 months prior to his biological termination, Butler traveled to Atlanta, Georgia, the newly established corporate epicenter of the mainstream hip-hop industry. He was booked for a press run that included a live radio interview on the highly influential station Hot 107.9, followed by an appearance at the Ozone Awards. What transpired on that radio broadcast and on that award show stage was not a calculated promotional strategy. It was a severe, unmedicated bipolar manic episode unfolding in real time, completely unshielded from the global media. Sitting in front of the studio microphones, Butler initiated a scorched earth, highly aggressive verbal assault on the entire contemporary music ecosystem. He fiercely attacked prominent Atlanta executives, insulted multi-platinum R&B vocalists, and aggressively condemned the entire corporate shift toward sanitized, ringtone-driven hip-hop. He named specific, highly powerful individuals within the corporate hierarchy, utilizing inflammatory, hostile rhetoric to accuse the industry of fundamentally diluting the Southern culture he had helped build. He then carried this exact volatile energy directly onto the stage of the Ozone Awards, aggressively doubling down on his hostility in front of a live audience of industry elites. The public reaction, engineered entirely by the print and digital media syndicates, was a masterpiece of cynical exploitation. The blogs, the radio conglomerates, and the magazines immediately spliced his frantic, hyper-aggressive vocalizations into viral sound bites. They framed his clinical breakdown as a legendary, fearless display of authentic street credibility. They labeled him a renegade truth-teller who refused to bow to corporate pressure. In the clinical reality of behavioral analysis, there was absolutely nothing heroic about this broadcast. The neurological filter separating his internal paranoia from his external vocalization had been completely eradicated by a lethal combination of untreated psychiatric illness and severe chemical toxicity. He was a deeply sick man exhibiting a textbook loss of impulse control, actively setting fire to his own professional perimeter because his brain was misfiring catastrophically. The most disturbing aspect of the Atlanta incident is the immediate, sociopathic response of the corporate syndicates surrounding him. The radio hosts, the interviewers, and his own management personnel recognized that he was operating in a state of severe, highly volatile mania. They saw the aggressive paranoia, the rapid, disjointed speech patterns, and the erratic physical movements. Yet, not a single individual intervened to cut the microphone. No one deployed crisis management protocols to pull him out of the studio and secure psychiatric intervention. Instead, the media corporations recognized that an unhinged, highly aggressive global icon generates exponential ratings and massive internet traffic. They actively encouraged the episode, deliberately stoking his paranoia on air to extract the most sensational, controversial quotes possible. They strip-mined his psychiatric breakdown for immediate short-term advertising revenue. However, once the viral news cycle concluded, the ruthless corporate arithmetic of the music industry immediately reasserted itself. By explicitly attacking the most powerful executives, booking agents, and artists in the epicenter of the market, Chad Butler rendered himself a massive, unpredictable liability. He had violated the foundational rule of the commercial entertainment complex. An artist is permitted to simulate violence and aggression for the consumer base, but they are never permitted to aggressively threaten the corporate hierarchy that funds the operation. The immediate consequence of the Atlanta broadcast was a rapid, silent, and highly efficient corporate quarantine. The industry syndicates subtly distanced themselves, collaborative opportunities vanished, promoters became increasingly hesitant to book a man who might commandeer a microphone and actively sabotage a multi-million-dollar event. This specific calculated industry alienation is the critical logistical variable that explains his final fatal trajectory. The media had successfully utilized his manic episode to generate massive profits, and then the industry promptly discarded him when he became too dangerous to manage. This engineered isolation severed his remaining professional lifelines to objective, rational civilian environments. He was forced back into a highly restricted, paranoid operational bubble, surrounded exclusively by the sycophants and the enablers who relied on his immediate cash flow and who would never question his consumption of the purple liquid. When Chad Butler eventually boarded the flight to Los Angeles in December of 2007, he was not traveling as an invincible, universally respected kin, GPN. He was traveling as a severely isolated, biologically failing outcast, actively bleeding out from 1,000 self-inflicted media-enabled professional wounds. The industry had successfully extracted his art, monetized his criminal record, and broadcasted his mental illness for ratings. Having consumed every viable piece of his existence, they simply stepped back, leaving him entirely alone to face the fatal consequences of the chemical coping mechanisms they had actively encouraged him to build. The final fatal intersection of his severe biological deficits and his relentless chemical dependency occurred in December of 2007, thousands of miles away from his Texas stronghold. He had traveled to Los Angeles, California, a city that functions as the absolute epicenter of the global entertainment complex, to finalize lucrative recording contracts and conduct high-profile media appearances. He was booked into the Mondrian Hotel, a luxury establishment situated on the Sunset Strip, an environment designed explicitly to cater to the excesses and the intense isolation of touring celebrities. The hotel room was not a sanctuary. It operated as a heavily insulated, sterile vault, where a severely sick man was left entirely to his own destructive devices after the corporate handlers and the sycophants had finally gone to sleep. He retreated into this private space, completely exhausted from the grueling demands of his promotional schedule, carrying the massive, crushing physical weight of his untreated obesity and the lethal purple chemical cocktail that the industry demanded he continue to consume. He was entirely alone, completely severed from any genuine medical oversight or basic human protection, locking the door behind him and effectively sealing himself inside a highly luxurious soundproof tomb. The scene discovered the following morning by hotel security and emergency personnel was a chilling, deeply disturbing tableau of absolute physical despair. It was a terrifyingly quiet, entirely unglamorous conclusion to a life that had been aggressively marketed as a loud, unstoppable force of nature. He was found dead, his massive physical frame collapsed onto the bed in a deeply unsettling kneeling posture. He was positioned as if he had spent his final agonizing moments desperately attempting to push himself up, or perhaps instinctively kneeling in a frantic, terrifying attempt to force oxygen into his failing lungs. A distinct, horrifying pool of blood had seeped from his mouth onto the pristine hotel linens, a grim biological indicator of the immense internal trauma his respiratory system had endured during the final struggle. Scattered around the silent room were candles that had completely burned down to the very bottom of their glass containers, leaving nothing but pools of hardened cold wax. This seemingly minor detail is a devastating forensic truth. The completely extinguished candles proved definitively that he had not suffered a sudden, instant cardiac arrest. He had been trapped in that room, actively suffocating, struggling, and eventually dying in absolute terrifying isolation for many consecutive hours while the flames slowly consumed the wax and the world outside continued entirely oblivious to his agony. The physiological mechanics of his death are a stark, irrefutable medical reality that completely destroys the glamorous mythology of the syrup-sipping lifestyle. He did not die from a romanticized, peaceful overdose. He died a violent, terrifying biological death triggered by the exact combination of his severe sleep apnea and the heavy narcotics he used to cope with his industry-mandated persona. When he finally laid down to sleep in that Los Angeles hotel room, the astronomical levels of prescription codeine and promethazine saturating his bloodstream executed their primary chemical function. The narcotics aggressively depressed his central nervous system, effectively turning off the primitive survival mechanisms in his brainstem. Simultaneously, his severe sleep apnea caused the heavy excess tissues of his throat to physically collapse inward, completely obstructing his trachea and entirely cutting off the flow of oxygen to his lungs. Under normal, unmedicated circumstances, the human brain detects this lethal drop in oxygen, triggers a massive surge of adrenaline, and forces the body to wake up violently to clear the airway. But his heavily sedated brain simply failed to sound the alarm. The syrup acted as a chemical gag. He was physically choking to death on his own biology, and the drugs ensured he remained entirely unconscious, while his internal organs were methodically starved of oxygen until his heart finally surrendered its rhythm. When the Los Angeles County coroner released the official autopsy report, citing the explicit, undeniable combination of promethazine and codeine toxicity combined with severe obstructive sleep apnea as the official cause of death, the public reaction was an immediate, highly revealing display of collective psychological denial. Instead of looking directly at the grim, unvarnished truth that a legendary artist had been killed by the very lifestyle and the specific chemicals that the culture had actively glorified and promoted, the entertainment industry and the millions of fans aggressively rejected the medical science. A profound collective cognitive dissonance took hold. The hip-hop community, the media commentators, and the suburban consumers absolutely refused to accept that the kingpin they worshipped had died such a vulnerable, preventable, and deeply tragic medical death. Accepting the coroner's report would require a massive, deeply uncomfortable cultural reckoning. It would mean acknowledging that the purple cup was not a symbol of power, but a lethal weapon. It would force the industry to admit their direct complicity in funding and encouraging his severe addiction. To avoid this crushing guilt and this devastating reality check, society instinctively and desperately reached for the comforting cinematic illusion of elaborate conspiracy theories. The most prominent and aggressively circulated fabrication was the deeply paranoid assertion that he had been deliberately assassinated by a shadowy, omnipotent syndicate, frequently referred to as the secret rulers of the entertainment industry. Proponents of this completely baseless theory pointed to a series of highly aggressive, unfiltered radio interviews he had conducted in the weeks leading up to his death. During these broadcasts, operating under the influence of his untreated bipolar mania, he had loudly and aggressively criticized prominent figures within the music business, called out industry corruption, and insulted powerful executives. The public eagerly seized upon these rants, spinning a fictional narrative that he was a courageous whistleblower who possessed dangerous, highly classified information about the systemic exploitation of artists. The theory argued that the corporate elites recognized him as a massive threat to their operations and dispatched professional assassins to quietly execute him in his hotel room to permanently silence his dissent. This specific conspiracy theory was incredibly seductive because it entirely absolved the artist of his severe chemical dependency and completely erased the reality of his failing physical health. It instantly transformed a sick, heavily addicted, and morbidly obese man dying from sleep apnea into a heroic, fearless political martyr who was tragically struck down by a powerful, invisible enemy while fighting for the truth. This desperate need to manufacture a human villain extended to the immediate members of his own deeply fractured inner circle. When the shadow government narrative failed to satisfy the demand for a localized, easily identifiable culprit, the conspiracy theorists turned their aggressive focus toward his legal wife and his closest Cal associates. Rumors rapidly infected the cultural discourse, asserting that he had been deliberately poisoned by someone he trusted. The public actively spread completely unfounded allegations that an associate, motivated by jealousy, financial greed, or a desire to seize control of his lucrative publishing rights, had maliciously slipped a lethal, undetectable toxin into his cup of syrup earlier that evening. Alternatively, some factions aggressively accused his widow of orchestrating a complex murder plot specifically to inherit his massive estate and secure his life insurance policies. These malicious, deeply destructive accusations were broadcasted across internet forums and whispered in recording studios, actively tearing apart the grieving family and completely destroying the reputations of the people who had actually attempted to survive his chaotic bipolar existence. The public was perfectly willing to destroy the lives of innocent, grieving individuals simply to protect their own deeply flawed perception of the artist they worshiped. The psychological architecture underpinning these wild, completely unsubstantiated conspiracy theories is the ultimate terrifying proof of a society entirely unwilling to confront the lethal consequences of the media it consumes. The public, the record executives, and the global fan base required a murder plot, a secret society, or a jealous spouse to explain his sudden death because the actual truth was far too agonizing and deeply indicting. If Chad Butler was assassinated by industry operatives or poisoned by a greedy associate, then his death was an external tragedy, an action movie plot twist that required absolutely no self-reflection from the people who bought his records. But if he died exactly as the medical examiner stated, choking on his own collapsed airway in a lonely hotel room because he was too heavily sedated by the prescription cough syrup the entire industry had encouraged him to drink, then the blame shift, TS entirely back onto the culture itself. It means that every single executive who authorized a studio budget knowing he was purchasing liquid opiates, every single radio programmer who put his drug-glorifying anthems into heavy rotation, and every single fan who cheered for his aggressive, chemically fueled persona was an active, undeniable accomplice to a slow-motion homicide. The conspiracy theories function as a massive, highly effective cultural shield. They are a cowardly, deliberate mechanism utilized by the masses to entirely avoid looking in the mirror. The public aggressively clung to the fiction of an assassination to completely deny the uncomfortable, blood-chilling reality that they had spent the last decade actively demanding, funding, and applauding the systematic biological destruction of a severely sick human being. The culture preferred to invent ghosts and shadow governments rather than admit that the culture itself was the actual murder weapon. The physical corpse of Chad Butler had barely been transported from that sterile Los Angeles hotel room to the county morgue before the absolute unvarnished reality of his financial empire was violently exposed to the public. The manufactured illusion of the untouchable, infinitely wealthy Southern kingpin entirely evaporated the very second his heart stopped beating, immediately replaced by a frantic, highly destructive scramble for the remaining scraps of his labor. The people who had surrounded him, the individuals who had actively enabled his severe chemical dependency and benefited from his massive touring revenue, did not pause to genuinely mourn the tragic loss of a deeply sick human being. They instantly transformed from a sycophantic entourage into a flock of ravenous vultures, circling the devastated estate with a singular, cold-blooded objective. The commercial music industry had successfully extracted every ounce of profitable art from his failing biology, and now his immediate circle was prepared to ruthlessly strip his legal legacy down to the absolute bone. The tragedy of his existence did not end with his asphyxiation. It simply transitioned from a physiological collapse into a sprawling, highly publicized financial slaughter. The primary responsibility for managing this highly complex multi-million-dollar musical legacy fell directly into the hands of his widow, who was legally appointed as the sole executor of the estate. Instead of fiercely protecting the foundational assets and securing the generational wealth for his surviving children, the immediate aftermath of his death was characterized by a staggering, entirely reckless display of financial negligence. The royalties generated by his historic catalog continued to flow into the estate accounts, but these funds were not utilized to solidify a stable future or protect his descendants. Hundreds of thousands of dollars were rapidly and aggressively hemorrhaged on frivolous, highly visible luxury expenses, maintaining the extravagant, high-rolling lifestyle that had originally driven the artist into an early grave. The estate was treated as an endless, completely unregulated cash register. The people managing his posthumous affairs were actively spending the money he had literally suffocated to earn, prioritizing immediate, superficial gratification over the grim, approaching reality of massive, entirely unpaid financial obligations. This reckless, uncontrolled financial hemorrhage deliberately ignored the most terrifying, uncompromising adversary in the American financial system. While the estate managers were purchasing luxury vehicles and funding an extravagant lifestyle, they completely neglected to pay the massive accumulating federal tax liabilities attached to his immense career earnings. The Internal Revenue Service does not operate on street credibility, nor does it respect the cultural legacy of a hip-hop pioneer. It operates strictly on cold, mathematical ledgers and ruthless collection tactics. The federal government aggressively audited the shattered estate, uncovering millions of dollars in unpaid taxes, severe financial penalties, and compounding interest. The devastating, undeniable consequence of this absolute mismanagement manifested in the most humiliating public manner possible. The sprawling, massive family mansion in Texas, the ultimate physical symbol of his entire life's work and his supposed financial invincibility, was forcefully seized by the banks and federal authorities. The iron gates were permanently locked, the property was aggressively foreclosed upon, and the physical sanctuary he had built was completely stripped away from his surviving family, auctioned off to the highest bidder simply to satisfy the crushing, undeniable debts left in the wake of his highly toxic lifestyle. The ultimate agonizing collateral damage of this financial wreckage was inflicted directly upon his own biological bloodline. The destruction foe, the estate aggressively fractured the family unit, transforming his surviving relatives into bitter, highly litigious adversaries fighting over a rapidly shrinking pool of resources. His biological son, Chad Butler Jr., was forcefully thrust into a grueling, incredibly expensive and deeply traumatizing legal war against the executor of his own father's estate. He was legally compelled to file a massive, highly publicized lawsuit simply to demand a basic accounting of the missing funds, and to aggressively attempt to salvage whatever minuscule fraction of his rightful inheritance had not already been squandered or seized by the federal government. The sprawling, highly lucrative empire of the notorious figure had completely devolved into a pile of aggressively contested legal briefs and unpaid tax notices. The recording studios and the massive stadium stages, where he had once commanded absolute authority, were entirely replaced by the sterile, emotionless environment of the probate courts. The tragic irony is absolute. The man who built an entire commercial persona around the concept of absolute control and financial dominance left behind a legacy defined entirely by catastrophic debt, severe financial mismanagement, and a deeply fractured family actively tearing each other apart in front of a judge. The unvarnished story of Pimp C is a damning indictment of the commercial entertainment complex. He was a musical pioneer who fundamentally altered the sonic landscape of an entire generation. Yet, his existence also highlights a capitalist machine that actively weaponizes human trauma for profit. The industry didn't view him as a vulnerable patient needing medical intervention. They saw a highly efficient mechanism for converting untreated mental illness and addiction into platinum albums. When his failing body finally collapsed on that hotel bed, the corporate machine didn't pause to mourn. They simply closed his ledger. It's an emotionless system that extracts every drop of profitable art from an artist only to step over their corpse, wipe the crown clean, and search for the next vulnerable talent to wear it.